We have been preaching and studying our way through the book of Acts, and very quickly we're coming upon a transition point in the book where Peter will cease to be the primary human actor, and that role will switch to Saul, who becomes Paul. We're a week or so away from that, but today we are in Acts chapter 12. Going to start with verse 1, read through the first part of verse 19. So we're starting with Acts chapter 12, verse 1. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this met with the approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for help. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Then the angel said to him, "Put on your clothes and sandals." And Peter did so. "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me," the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through. When they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen." When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting that it was so, they said, "It must be his angel." But Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of prison. "Tell James and the other brothers and sisters about this," he said, and then he left for another place. This James would be not the one who had been executed, but James, the half-brother of Jesus, who was becoming a bigwig in the church in Jerusalem at this time. In the morning, there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and did not find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed. There's 3 stories in this passage. There's 4 if you count the poor unfortunate guards who were executed by Herod. But there are 3 stories we're going to focus on. The one that takes up the first half of this passage, there's the story of Peter. And in the story of Peter, God rescues him directly and right out. God just does what needs to be done and saves Peter. Peter is arrested. He's placed in jail. They've got a rotation of 16 guards. That's how important of a prisoner that he was. Maybe Herod is aware that Peter has been released from prison before, miraculously, something which Peter himself seems to have forgotten for a little bit in this story. But there's 16 guards, and one night Peter's asleep, chained to 2 guards, and I think this is so hilarious. I laugh when I read it. The angel shows up and hits him in the side to wake him up. You may not find that funny, I do. And says, "Get up, we're going to go." They walk past one sentry, they walk past another sentry, they come to a gate that opens by itself, they walk through it, and all this time Peter's thinking that this is just a vision. That's why I say it seems to me he may have forgotten that this had happened before, that he'd been rescued miraculously. After a block, when they get outside the prison, they walk one block and the angel disappears. And Peter comes to himself and realizes, okay, this has actually happened. God has once again miraculously rescued me. He saved me from jail. He saved me from Herod. So in Peter's story, God rescues him directly and straight out. Then there's the story of the believers who are praying for Peter. We're told they're praying earnestly. The word implies stretched out or prolonged. So it could mean they were praying continuously overnight. It could mean their hands were up, raised in prayer. All we know is that they were praying fervently and earnestly for Peter. Now, what do you think they were praying? God, please get Peter out of jail. Because we know what could happen to him if Herod is able to bring him to trial. So they are all gathered together in Mary's house, the mother of John, and they are praying, Lord, please release Peter. There's a knock at the door. And there's humor in this story too. Rhoda, the servant girl, goes to answer it. She recognizes Peter's voice. She gets so excited. She runs to the people who are praying, Lord, please release Peter. She says, Peter's at the front door. And they say, you're out of your mind. Now, please, you got to see the humor in that. They are praying. Their prayer has been answered. And they say, it can't be. They say, it must be his angel. Back then, they believed everybody had a guardian angel, and some believed that the angel looked like the person they were protecting. So maybe this was Peter's guardian angel. But finally, they go and they see that, yes, this is Peter. So in their story, God does answer their prayer. In fact, he answers their prayer most likely in the exact way they were asking, and yet when it happens, they're caught off guard. They were surprised. They didn't expect it. There's a third story. Gets only one sentence. And Herod had James put to death by the sword. One sentence, and it's really easy to pass over James in this passage. Because whereas God directly rescued Peter, and whereas God directly answered the prayers of the believers, even though they were surprised by it, God didn't rescue James. And he died unjustly. Someone might read this story and think, well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. God rescued Peter square out. Fantastic. God answered the prayers of the believers, and even though they answered in the exact way they wanted, they were still surprised by it, but still, God answered their prayers. That's fantastic. James, well, James got the short end of the stick. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Well, that way of thinking about these different stories ignores the reality about God's character. That God is always and intimately involved in every aspect of our lives. We call this God's sovereignty. Everything that happens to us, everything that happens through us, everything that happens around us, everything that happens, period, happens either because God has caused it or God has allowed it. Those are the only 2 options. God has caused it or God has allowed it, because God is sovereign, which means that everything that happens as a result of his direct action or of him allowing something to happen. When we suffer, especially when we suffer for our faith, but when we suffer at all, God always acts, even when it appears to us that he is absent. Because we don't know the big picture. We see the immediate moment and we think, God, why are you not rescuing me? Why are you not healing me? Why are you not coming through? We don't know what else is going on. So let's see what this tells us about God. That God always responds when we are in trouble, even when we think he's not. And based on the text we've read, sometimes God rescues us straight out. A woman with severe kidney problems goes to her doctor for a checkup. The doctor comes back in and says, I can't explain it. You're 100% fine. I have no idea. In fact, the doctor is so skeptical, he does the tests again. He comes back, he says, I don't know. It's gone. You are perfectly healthy. Sometimes God rescues us straight out like that. A man loses his job because he starts a Bible study at work during lunch. And within a week, he ends up with a better paying job that he enjoys more. A direct rescue from God. A young woman in college, her boyfriend dumps her because she says, I'm not going to have sex until I get married. And she ends up with a nicer, kinder, actual Christian boyfriend. Sometimes God rescues us straight out. What some people call luck, we call God. And then sometimes God rescues us. He answers our prayers in a way that catches us off guard, in a way maybe we didn't expect. While they're doing tests on the woman with kidney issues, they find out she has some serious heart issues. And they're able to treat her before that gets too serious. And so God has, in a roundabout way, rescued her through the other problem she had going on. The man who's fired, the boss who fires him gets fired. And the new boss hires the guy back. And he's a much better boss. The young woman in college whose boyfriend dumps her because she will not sleep with him. She ends up with a stronger faith and a stronger sense of her self-worth as a daughter of God, which is more important than anybody else's opinion. What some people call chance, we call God. But then we see in James that sometimes God doesn't rescue us. The woman with kidney problems dies. The man who loses his job also loses his house. The young Christian college woman ends up alone and lonely for a long, long time. And what some people call disappointment, we call opportunity. George Wood is a pastor. He's a superintendent with the Assemblies of God. And he calls that last option, when God does not swoop in and rescue us, directly or indirectly, he calls those God's non-interventions. And in fact, he preached a sermon titled God's Non-Interventions. He says that God's non-intervention is a companion to his interventions. Both are part of his actions. In other words, both are an expression of God's sovereignty. Both his action and his inaction are an expression of God's sovereignty. What we perceive from our very limited point of view as the inaction of God may be the deeper, further reaching action of God. And in this sermon, Wood offers 6 reasons why God may not intervene. And I'm very thankful for the insights I got from him from reading this sermon. The first thing he says, sometimes God doesn't intervene to preserve human freedom. God gives us choices. From the very beginning, we have had the right to choose between right and wrong. And Adam and Eve chose wrong, and the rest of us, we've paid for it ever since. But if God were to intervene in every situation in our lives, he would turn us into puppets. And he did not create us as puppets. He created us in his image. That includes having a free will. And we get to choose how we're going to exercise that will, for good or for bad. Wood says for us to be, or the terrible sufferings of believers in the book of Acts is always rising out of the evil deeds of other people, which comes from their freedom to act. And then he says, let us rather suffer evil than do evil. In other words, since we have this freedom, let's choose good instead of evil. Let's choose right instead of wrong. So sometimes when we're hurting, when we're lost, when we're sick, when we're broke, and God doesn't intervene, according to Wood, this is God allowing us freedom to make choices and hoping and trusting that through the Holy Spirit we will choose correctly. The second reason he says God doesn't intervene is because God is allowing us to mature. We don't mature during the soft times. We mature during the hard times. We mature when we have to struggle and wrestle. In the first service, we had an infant dedication. And I didn't say this during the dedication, but during the sermon I said, the worst thing, and I'm not a parent, I'll admit that, But the worst thing a parent can do is meet every single need a child has and respond super immediately. You got to be appropriate to the age level, but children need to learn. We get boo-boos. We get owies. And again, at an appropriate age level, you've got to respond appropriately. The worst thing you can do is instantly react to everything that goes wrong, to every unfairness life throws your child's way. I said, in fact, the best thing you can do for your kid is let them roll in mud and kiss dirty dogs, because that will build up their immune system. And they're not going to get sick later in life. We mature through the rough stuff. Wood says, God delights in giving us choices so we can develop wisdom and maturity. He turns to us and says, now that you've asked for my will to be done, I'm going to turn back to you and say, your will be done. And when God says that to us, he hopes that our will be in line with his will. And Wood says this is terribly frightening, but this is the freedom that God gives us. So sometimes God doesn't intervene because he wants us to mature. Third, sometimes God doesn't intervene because it's an opportunity for us to show grace. It's really easy to be graceful during the good times, isn't it? It's the bad times when what is truly within us comes to light. It is during the rough times that what is in our heart reveals itself through our mouth and our attitudes and our behaviors. He says our life is a cup. When something hits us that is external, whatever is in the cup spills out. If what's in the cup is anger and resentment and rage and bitterness, then that's what spills out. But if in the cup is the fruit of the Spirit, love and joy and peace and the grace of Jesus Christ, when we are hit, out of the cup spills the grace of Jesus Christ. God's non-interventions give us a unique opportunity to display that grace. I mentioned two of my friends during the prayer time, pastors who have had weeks that I could not have imagined in the worst of circumstances, stuff that I would not dream in my worst nightmares. And I've been in touch with both of them, and through everything they have experienced, they have shown truly amazing Christ-like grace. God could have interceded and stopped both of the situations that these men faced, but he didn't. And through going through these instances, these men have had the opportunity. Their cup is full, to use Wood's metaphor, of the grace of Jesus Christ. And when life hit them externally, what poured out of that cup was the grace of Jesus Christ. So sometimes when we're hurting and God doesn't intervene, it's an opportunity for us to exercise grace. Next, he says, sometimes God doesn't intervene because that's how God advances the gospel. We talked about this way back, I forget what chapter, but Stephen. You know, when Stephen was stoned, this great persecution broke out against the church. The believers left Jerusalem and spread out north and northwest and south and carried the gospel with them. God could have intervened. God could have stopped the stoning of Stephen. But what we see happen, because God knows the big picture and we don't, is that through that stoning and the persecution that broke out after it, the gospel was spread. Our very salvation rests on God not intervening. God could have taken Jesus down from the cross, but he didn't. Jesus even prayed, Father, let this cup pass me by. The cup is an Old Testament metaphor for pain and for suffering. But then he ended with the true Lord's Prayer, not my will be done, but yours. God could have taken him down. Old song says he could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. He could have called 10,000 angels, but he died alone for you and me. And it was so bad because Christ was bearing the sin of everyone who was ever lived or was ever going to live. God couldn't look at it and had to turn his back. And yet God still did not intervene and take Christ down from the cross because it needed, that was necessary for our salvation. Our salvation rests on the very non-intervention of God. Wood says sometimes God doesn't intervene because it deepens our faith. When we have to struggle with the questions, God, why aren't you intervening? Why am I suffering? Why is my family suffering? Why are my friends going through what they went through. It is by struggling with that, by learning to depend on God, that our faith grows and develops. And then the sixth reason he gives really isn't a reason. It's just a statement. We may never know. When it comes to why God does not intervene in our pains and our sorrows and our sadness and our brokenness, we may never know. I'll add the caveat. We may never know until we get to heaven. Now, I hope and I pray that maybe one of those insights from Pastor Woods helps you understand and deal with a non-intervention you're going through right now. Because I know many people in the congregation are waiting for a miracle or waiting for a direct intervention, an indirect intervention, and God is not intervening. And I'm hoping that through the insights that God gave Pastor Wood and I was able to share with you, that maybe a chord has been struck and it brings things a little more in perspective, makes it a little easier to trust in God's sovereignty, to trust that God is in control even when it seems that everything else is out of control. As I said, we may not know why God chooses to not act until we get to heaven. And there we are going to see everything clearly. Right now we're stuck in the moment. We're stuck in the pain. And so all we see is our little bit. In heaven we're going to see the huge panorama of salvation history. And we're going to see where my suffering in this moment fits into God's overall plan for the salvation of humanity. For now, from our limited perspective, when God chooses to not intervene, it's an opportunity. It is an opportunity for us to trust, to mature, to show faith, to show grace. It's an opportunity for God to do things that we could not imagine in ways that we cannot imagine. It is an opportunity for us to maybe peek behind the curtain a little bit, because we never know what is going on back there. You know, we're told our true battle is in the spiritual world. I mean, we're acting out our part here on the physical plane, but the true spiritual battle that Christians are involved in goes on behind the scenes. And we often have no clue as to what's going on behind the scenes. So when God chooses to not act, we need to remember there's a bigger picture. The woman with kidney trouble, a woman of faith, but her doctor, stereotypical man of science, cause and effect. And he comes in and he says to her, I can't explain it. You're clear. She says, I can explain it. It's God. And this skeptical doctor gets to hear about Jesus Christ. Or he walks in, he says, I'm sorry, you have 3 months. And he gets to see the grace of Jesus Christ shining through this woman as she faces an imminent death with faith and trust and grace in God. The man who loses his job and his house, of course, didn't see this coming, but he's got little kids. And they're watching Daddy. And they hear every night at dinner when he says grace and says, Lord, we know we're going through troubles now, but we trust that you're in control. And one way or the other, your will is going to be done through this. And they hear that as little children. And they grow up into that faith. The college student whose boyfriend dumped her because she wouldn't sleep with him has a little sister who looks up to her and wants to be like big sister. And so through that struggle, through that non-intervention of God, the big sister, God is able to save the little sister through the big sister. Self-doubt, possibly abuse, pregnancy, perhaps even abortion in high school, because she watched her older sister struggle through God's non-intervention. And she said, I want to be like my big sis. Even James, he gets one sentence. And Herod had James put to death by the sword. One sentence. But how many millions of martyrs has that one sentence inspired over the last 2,000 years? Men and women who died for Christ and who maybe brought that one sentence to mind and were able to say, if James can suffer for Christ, I can suffer for Christ. Adjith Fernando, he's an evangelist. He wrote a commentary on Acts. He says, in our fast-moving age, we want immediate evidence to feel that the sacrifices we make are worthwhile. that God may reserve that revelation until we get to heaven, which will make it all the more glorious. God always acts when we're in trouble. God is acting right now if you're suffering. Sometimes he rescues us right out. Sometimes he comes through in a way that at best leaves us baffled, or at worst leaves us angry and doubting. In those occasions when God rescues you, then I hope you were listening to Pam's children's story this morning about being thankful. When God rescues you right out, then tell people about it and thank God for it and shout yourself hoarse, letting people know God has saved me. But when God doesn't come through the way we want him to, that's the time to just do our best through his power to peek behind the curtain to see what he's up to. To remember my view is limited, but God's is unlimited. To remember God, even when he is not acting, is acting because he has a plan in motion. Pray that God will stretch your vision beyond your own problems, as terrible as they are, to see his possibilities. And pray that your suffering will not be wasted. That God will use it for his purposes. And that one day you will get to heaven and you'll get to find out what those purposes were. Amen.